Welcome. I'm Debbie Haynes and this is my colleague Lana Draper, and we'll be presenting today on consulting the social and emotional wellbeing framework to guide delivery of trauma therapies for Aboriginal children and young people in out-of-home care. So we'd like to acknowledge the Yugambeh people as the traditional owners of the land, seas and waterways of the Gold Coast region that we are presenting to today. We pay our respects to elders past, present and extend that respect to Indigenous community members who are here with us. And in keeping with this year's NAIDOC theme, we want to recognise and acknowledge the warriors before us, who fought for change in our communities, and today's champions who continue to fight for change, equal rights and basic human rights for our mob. So in 2015, David Tune was commissioned by the New South Wales Government to conduct an independent review of the out-of-home care system within New South Wales. And the review concluded that the current system was ineffective and unsustainable. There was no evidence of expenditure improving the long-term outcomes for children and families, or of arresting the devastating cycles of intergenerational trauma. Outcomes for Aboriginal children and young people were significantly poorer compared to non-Aboriginal children and young people, and programs were not culturally aligned with Aboriginal children and young people or their families' needs. So in response to the recommendations, the Links Trauma Healing Service was commissioned to deliver evidence-based programs to children and young people who are currently in out-of-home care. Two multidisciplinary teams were established over two key New South Wales regions, the Hunter Central Coast and the Penrith Blue Mountains, with both teams including a child and adolescent psychiatrist, Aboriginal psychologists and non-Aboriginal psychologists and mental health clinicians, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal occupational therapists and speech pathologists. So our aim was to improve psychological, emotional and social wellbeing of our children, young people and their families by reducing trauma symptoms, improving language and functional development, increasing engagement in school and strengthening caregiver capacity. Importantly, we aim to strengthen identity, sense of belonging and connectedness to country, culture and community. So 50% of the Links cohort identify as Aboriginal, with treatment protocols having cultural consultation. Protocols and resources are also adapted to suit Aboriginal children and young people and their families in the program. Psychologists delivered evidence-based interventions, parent-child interaction therapy, eye movement desensitisation and reprocessing, trauma-focused cognitive behavioural therapy, and the Tuning Into program. These interventions were delivered individually, or children and young people would receive an individual intervention and their carer would participate in the Tuning In program during the intervention period. 3 evaluation reports conducted by the Parenting Research Centre concluded significant positive effects on wellbeing of children and young people and carers, with no significant effect on treatment outcomes for children who identify as Aboriginal. So up until September of 2021, there have been 601 accepted referrals into the Links program. All participants were 3 years to 16 years. Participation was voluntary throughout the course of the treatment phase, with referral into the Links program submitted via the child or young person's caseworker. The referral criteria included the child or young person being 16 years or under, who was in statutory foster care, relative care or kinship care, where instability in placement was observed and the placement was at a high risk of breakdown. Instability criteria were met if the child or young person had 2 or more placement changes within the last 6 months. This includes the restoration back to the biological parents, or where respite care had been used at an increased rate in the past 12 months. So as from March 2021, data showed 54% of the Links cohort were identified as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, and 53% were in relative or Aboriginal kinship care. Approximately 70% of the children and young people were identified as having language support needs, and 100% of our children and young people had 1 or more support needs for OT. Analysis of outcomes to March of 2021 showed that there had been a 59% improvement in carer wellbeing. Between July 2020 and March 2021, Links clinicians had participated and navigated the restoration of 10 Aboriginal children back to their parents. Current data showed in 12 months prior to an entry to the Links service, young people had on average around 12 risk of serious harm reports. And for children who had left the program with goals complete, there were 0 risk of serious harm reports in the subsequent 12 months thereafter. So data recorded on the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire showed approximately 89% of children and young people saw one or more improvements, with the largest improvement in the emotional problem scale. And on the trauma symptom checklist or trauma symptom checklist for children, approximately 96% of children and young people saw one or more improvements, with the largest improvements within the post-traumatic stress disorder, depression and anger subscales. Service satisfaction surveys completed at exit showed 93% of their carers were satisfied that Links clinicians respected their child's culture. And service satisfaction surveys completed by the children showed 91% of the children and young people were satisfied that Links staff had respected their culture. So I'll now pass over to Lana to present a case study.
So we're going to present a young 6-year-old boy, and we're going to present we'll showcase the work that we've done within the social emotional wellbeing framework. So first of all, his presenting symptoms included attention and concentration difficulties, anxiety, sleep disturbances, attachment and relationship issues, emotional dysregulation, and a trauma history, both sexual and physical. Mum was incarcerated and dad was unknown. He had 4 kinship placements in 18 months and 1 substantiated abuse in care report. He was linked in with Aboriginal sexual assault counselling services and Aboriginal family preservation services. There were 3 care team changes and 4 casework team changes in 12 months, and he was not attending school full time. So on the trauma symptom checklist for young children, he had on entry, he was showing clinically significant on subscales for sexual concerns, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression and anxiety. On the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, he showed very high total difficulties, clinically significant impact on home life, friendships, school life and leisure activities. So we're looking at the SUB framework. We'll start with the connection to culture. Our young person was disconnected in every one of the 7 domains of the SUB framework. So what we did was he was allocated to an Aboriginal psychologist, Deb, and then I was onboarded as part of the process. We initially shared our own cultural connections as it was necessary for us to break down colonial perceptions of Aboriginal people. We used cultural occupations to engage him in intervention sessions such as painting, drawing, movement and music to build distress tolerance and some education around spear making, which was an interest of his. We provided books and information about his own culture as he became curious, and we worked with school and family to provide participation in cultural events and activities. Connection to family and kinship. So we worked with mum post-incarceration to increase his access visits, build safety and trauma response skills. So it's important to note that our young person had very limited family connections. And due to his level of hypervigilance and trauma behaviours, family were not skilled in trauma-informed care responses, which impacted their ability to care for him long term. This experience was shared by other family members, and as such, he was in an ACA placement with care staff and visiting his auntie on weekends. No other family were connected to our young man at the time of his commencement into the Links program. While mum was incarcerated, he had no contact with her in any format, and when mum re-entered community, Deb worked with her to re-establish attachment with the vision of restoration. So we built relationships with the family, promoted repair between family members and created support networks for restoration back to mum. We used culturally appropriate tools such as My Deadly Book About Me to build family connections, lineage and ancestry. And we worked with extended family to access family finding and cultural resources. Connection to community. We worked with the school to develop relationships at school and culturally competent trauma responses. So school was where we started because that was the biggest role that he was engaged in that was linked to community. So he was spending minimal time in the classroom and had 10-minute activities scheduled to keep him in the classroom. He was supervised on the playground, not allowed to play outside with peers by himself due to high trauma behaviours and a risk of vulnerability. There was a high level of education that we provided along with support delivered to the schools, such as individualised tuning into kids program, which was aimed at shifting teaching staff attitudes to a more trauma-informed approach. So we advocated for cultural community activities as well, such as Dig and dance, and also cultural mentoring. We also worked with him in his natural environment, going to the beach, meeting him at parks, meeting him at his placement, and accessing the pool, which was a favourite activity of his. Connection to mind and emotions. He participated in some safety installation using EMDR. He worked on emotional regulation within the TFCBT framework. He did some awareness of my body around sexual behaviour education. The tuning into kids was delivered to care teams, support workers, family and teaching staff. And a sensory profiling to support with sensory strategies for anxiety management and regulation. We installed visuals to support routines, predictability and independence in self-care tasks. And at the end of the program, he was actually able to co-regulate another child after being kicked by him. And he was quoted as saying, "I feel like that sometimes too, and I take some deep breaths." And then he was able to get the child to work with him on breathing. Connection to country and land. So through the building of connections in the other domains, such as connection to culture, family and kinship, community, and mind and emotions, his connection to country and land was developed through mum rebuilding her connection to an uncle and going back to country. Connection to body and behaviours. So here we worked on emotional regulation, building emotional intelligence, using a sensory profile to understand sensory processing through different emotions, did about my body work. We created a behaviour support plan, which incorporated all of those previous strategies. And there was an implementation of trauma-informed responses to behaviours by all the people around him. And again, the installation of visuals to support him communicating his emotions. Connection to spirit, spirituality and ancestors. So when he went back with mum, his spirit started to rest. We observed, and it was also reported, that he had a decrease in trauma-based behaviours. And connecting him back to mum and family allowed mum to connect back to her spirit and reconnect back to country. And through social modelling, we were able to connect family back to culture and kin, which ignited their spirit to engage in building cultural connection and their own spirits. So overall, the SUB outcomes that we seen was that he was restored back to mum and he spends time at family gatherings. So previously spending time in large groups was triggering for our young person and overstimulating, which would often see him dysregulate. All the family have come back together and they're now enjoying barbecues and special occasions, and he gets to play and reconnect with cousins. So he gets to connect to country as well, visiting his uncle who lives on country. We've seen an engagement in cultural occupations such as learning Dig, dance and spear making. He's supporting peers in conflict through his own reconnection to mind and emotions, body and behaviours. He's attended to and completed a full cognitive assessment, which is really significant because on his entry into the LINKS program, he was only able to engage in sessions for a maximum of 5 minutes, and he attended to the cognitive assessment for an hour and a half. He's now able to identify and label emotions effectively, and he attends school full time. So when we're looking at the pre and post data scores, you can see on the pre-intervention scores, our young person has a strong mental health presentation. And you can see in the post-intervention scores that by combining the social emotional wellbeing framework using culturally adapted evidence-based interventions and the application of an MDT approach, he experienced significant reductions in trauma symptoms and behaviours. So we've seen a significant reduction in scores for post-traumatic stress disorder, sexual concerns, and post-traumatic stress disorder intrusion.
So some current research that I've recently done for my master's thesis, we conducted it on the LINCS data with a particular focus on the data for the Aboriginal children and young people in our program. So we looked at the data from October 2017 to August 2020. And that showed statistically significant outcomes for children and young people who identified as Aboriginal, who had received a service from LINCS, and the children did not have to complete the entire treatment period to experience positive outcomes. So parent-child interaction therapy shows the highest efficacy for treatment outcomes for Aboriginal children under 8 years old, with trauma-focused CBT most effective for Aboriginal children and young people who were not allocated to the PCIT treatment. Data showed a significant reduction in trauma symptoms for Aboriginal children overall, and an interaction was shown between culture of client and culture of treating psychologist. So what we found was that Aboriginal children experienced larger reductions in trauma symptoms when allocated to a non-Aboriginal psychologist, and non-Aboriginal children experienced larger reductions in trauma symptoms when allocated to an Aboriginal psychologist. So for outcomes on the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, data showed both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children experienced larger reductions in difficulties if they were allocated to an Aboriginal psychologist. So these results could be explained by the consistent cultural consultation that occurred between the treating psychologist and Aboriginal team members on the evidence-based protocols and the application of service provided by the multidisciplinary clinicians. Also, all clinicians utilised cultural resources, and collaboration advocacy for cultural inclusion was a focus for children and young people in the service. So thanks. We'll now take any questions.